David, good afternoon. Thank you for taking some time out for us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me today.
I want to start with just your decision to get into this race. You served the 2 terms, then you did not run for re-election. 2 years later, you decide, I want to run again and serve again. So to kind of walk us through that decision on your part, why you decided you wanted to serve in the legislature again.
Yes, I was honored to serve 2 terms in the Iowa House from 2012 to 2016. I accomplished a lot of things. I believe I worked on a lot of legislation on a bipartisan fashion. Even being in the House minority, I was able to get things passed through the House unanimously. Some bills that had to deal with education funding, bills that had to do with the expansion of the Jackson Recovery Crisis Stabilization Center for Youth. We also worked on reauthorizing the Access Iowa Highways, which helped the 4-lane completion of Highway 20. And my final year, I worked on some criminal justice reform that included reduction of penalties of mandatory sentences for nonviolent drug offenses, while also increasing a penalty for a constituent who requested that there be a mandatory minimum for the death of a child in a child endangerment case. So I worked on a lot of things, thought I'd accomplished a lot, and I had really returned to focusing as working as a prosecutor in the Woodbury County Attorney's Office, where I've now worked for over a decade. But then the 2017 to 2018 sessions occurred, and I was not real happy with the direction that the state had taken after those 2 sessions, so I decided that somebody needed to stand up that had experience, that could work well in the legislature, and fight for a better direction. A direction that focuses on making sure we have a strong school system in our state, from preschool through community college, focusing on putting policies in place to raise incomes for Iowa families, and also focuses tax relief where it matters most, with middle-income working families, and not just giving more tax breaks to out-of-state corporations that aren't really helping Iowans or creating jobs. So I think we need to refocus our energies in the state of Iowa on those issues.
So to get back in was a direct result of what you have seen occur within the General Assembly the last 2 years.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about some of those issues in a little more detail. Let's start with Medicaid, which is one of the biggest topics under discussion in the state today. It's a divisive subject, strong feelings on both sides. Kind of give us your assessment of the privatization, the move to privatization, how that's working or isn't working, and what would your approach be, if not what we're doing today with the MCOs and managed care?
Well, and I served my last year in the Iowa House in 2016. Governor Branstad did make the decision to move towards privatized managed care of our Medicaid system for the state of Iowa. And that serves over 600,000 Iowans, 70% of which are either elderly or disabled individuals. And I just didn't think it was the right move, because when you're talking about managed care, you're trying to improve outcomes and improve health. And most people who are disabled or elderly, those conditions aren't going to be changing. So I didn't think managed care was the right approach, and I also believe that based on the experience of other states, that it wasn't going to save the state money, and it wasn't going to save the taxpayers any dollars. And ultimately that's proven to be true. There's been over 40,000 Iowans who've been denied services that they used to receive under the system, and just recently the 2 MCOs that are left in the system were given a 7.5% pay increase for their efforts, which haven't been very good for the state of Iowa. I work on a nonprofit board, New Perspectives, here in Sioux City, that we've had to write off claims as a result of the MCOs denying payments for services that have been rendered to intellectually disabled individuals who want to stay in their homes and stay in their communities and work towards a better career outcome with job training that we provide through that program. So I think the privatization of the Medicaid system has been a disaster for Iowa. It's not saving us taxpayer dollars, and it should be one of the first things that is done in the next session, is to end those private contracts and return control to the state Medicaid system that used to run for lower administrative costs. The administrative costs used to be 2 to 3% per year, and now the administrative cost with the private MCOs is about 10% or more per year, which is not really providing the level of services that needs to be provided to clients in the state of Iowa.
Obviously, the reason that the move was made to the privatization was that the track of costs under the old system were rising at a level that was not sustainable for the long term. There was that Medicaid costs were eating a bigger piece of the state budget pie every year, and we couldn't stay on that track. If we go back to that system, will we not get back onto the same unsustainable track of increasing costs that we were on before? that led to this decision?
A lot of the change in the increased cost has to do with the federal match rate and the FMAP rate. And as a result of Iowa having a better economy for a few years in that change period, that the federal reimbursement rates were lower, so the state match had to be higher for our percentage. It really didn't have to do with increasing the amount of services or the amount of clients in the system. So I believe, though, that if you're giving a 7.5% increase in pay to the MCOs, you're costing the state more, and that's growing at a faster rate than it was when it was managed by the state. Most government-run programs have some cost of living increases every year because costs of goods and services for most, even businesses increase year over year. So there has to be some growth allowed for many programs that the state runs, including schools, transportation costs. But I don't believe that the costs were unsustainable. I think there could have been changes that were made so that the fee-for-service program was not being abused. Making sure that we are focusing on better outcomes, especially for that other 30% who are not disabled or elderly. We could focus on those types of better managed care programs, but the state had the ability to do that, and I think that's where we should have focused on trying to reduce costs.
But, you served in the House. I don't know for sure in those particular years, but many years I was down there covering the legislature, there were supplemental appropriations for Medicaid almost every year. Was an indication of either poor budgeting or, in generally the case, was the cost just exceeded what the estimates were just because of the population being served. And I guess there are statistics showing that it's taking up more and a greater share of the state budget. I'm hearing from you that you don't really see that as a problem. I guess is that right? Or
You don't want to waste taxpayer dollars, but you also need to provide services to people who need services who otherwise can't access them. There are a lot of people who are disabled or elderly who don't work, who don't have other sources of income or working for an employer who provides health coverage for them. So we are providing a safety net for people who can't otherwise access services that they need to stay in their home and to stay alive in many cases. But with regards to the supplemental appropriations for the Medicaid system in the Iowa House, I believe it's because the House Republicans repeatedly, year after year, would go with the lowest projected number instead of the midline or the high projection of what the actual cost would be, so they weren't budgeting appropriately. I think they've continued to have that problem where they've had to de-appropriate. For the 4 years that I was in the Iowa House, we never had to de-appropriate once. We never had to borrow from our rainy day account once, and I believe that's because the Senate was controlled by Democrats, and that's why I think I should run and I should be elected, because Democrats better managed the budget. We didn't have to de-appropriate or defund or borrow from the rainy day account, which happened 4 times over the last 2 years.
I mean, you don't want to speak for your experience, but that there were times when it was both houses controlled by the Democrats where they did have to have supplementals. So I mean, I don't think it's a problem unique to one party, but obviously you disagree with.
I know about the 4 years that I was there.
Sure, I understand.
Let's talk about education then. Obviously, a lot of discussion over the last 2 sessions in the amount of state aid that was given to K-12 schools. I think it was 1% this past session, a little over 1% the session before. Is that, in your estimation, doing right by K-12 education? What do you think is a more appropriate, if that's too small, what do you think is a more appropriate level of funding for public schools in Iowa?
Well, when we budget anything, we need to make sure we budget our priorities, and education should be our priority in the state, so we have a strong education system, like I said, from preschool through community college. So I would make sure that if we are funding programs, that we make sure that they're sustainable and they're well funded. My opponent for the last 2 years, Jim Carlin, did vote for 1.2% and 1% of allowable growth for our K-12 education, which is not a good result. This past year, 7 of the 11 school districts in Senate District 3 were put on budget guarantee, which means that they still had the spending authority of what they had last year, but because of declining enrollment, they were not provided the state funding at the same level, which ultimately results in increased property taxes in those rural school districts. So if we're not funding our rural schools at an appropriate percentage each year to make sure that we're maintaining funding for their programs, they won't be able to stay open. We'll lose our small rural schools, and our small towns will suffer as a result of that. So I think it's important that we fund at an appropriate level from the state so that our local property taxpayers and residents and agricultural owners are not hit harder with higher property taxes to fund the schools.
And obviously, education takes up a big chunk of the state budget. So if you increase from, say, 1% to 2% or 1% to 3%, it's a lot of additional money that you would be providing to education. Where would that come from?
Those additional percentages is sometimes between 40 or 50 million dollars per extra percent. There are, I believe, many tax credits that have been identified that are not serving the state well, and those corporate tax credits that are not serving the state well, helping create jobs, could be closed. It's my understanding there's over $12 billion in tax credits that are out there that the state funds every year, and our budget is only about $7.2 billion. Somewhere in that $12 billion worth of tax credits, something could be cut that's not serving an effective purpose. That's why I believe all tax credits should have sunsets on them to make sure that they're reviewed regularly, to make sure that if we passing them, they are serving a purpose that is helping the state of Iowa grow.
And that was on my list, so let's just talk about that in a little more detail. That's another topic that gets a lot of discussion, and you get conflicting viewpoints on how much the state spends and what it spends on, and what it gets in return from tax incentive programs. So you believe we spend too much on tax incentive programs, or we don't spend the dollars that we spend wisely enough and get a proper enough return on that investment? How do you view just overall how Iowa spends money in tax incentives for economic development?
I'm not opposed to using tax incentives smartly to create good paying jobs to the state, but I don't think we should just be handing out tax credits to corporations like Apple, who's the largest corporation in the world with $1 trillion in assets. I don't think they needed several $1 million from the state to create a data center down in Polk County. I don't think that was the right way to go. I also don't believe that the research and development tax credit should be providing a refund to corporations. If it ultimately ends out that they have zero taxes as a result of the research and development they do, that's great. We should encourage those types of programs to continue, but they shouldn't be getting a paycheck back from the state. They shouldn't be getting money back over and above what they would actually owe in any taxes. So those types of tax credit programs that are not really creating incentives and paying corporations that don't really need additional money invested from taxpayers, especially middle-class, low-income individuals who shouldn't be giving money to large corporations from other states that aren't going to help our local economy and help grow the state with good-paying jobs.
But you're confident that a review would produce the closing or the elimination of some programs you don't feel are working the way they should be. You feel that that kind of process would result in enough money that you could put into different areas of priority, such as education, for example.
Yes.
That would be the place you would look for additional funds for education.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about tax cuts. Then the legislature passed the package of tax cuts in the last session. So I'm wondering again what your overall assessment of that bill is. The criticism is that, which I'm going to presume that you would agree with, is that the package was too heavily weighted toward the affluent and to corporations, and middle class didn't get enough relief through that bill. So tell us what your position, what your view on that bill is overall.
I believe that there are provisions in the bill that are going in the right direction, especially for people in middle income categories, especially those making probably less than $100,000 a year. I think our tax system in the state of Iowa is too complicated and not transparent enough, and if we could simplify it and reduce rates for people to make it a simpler system, getting rid of the complexity of federal deductibility, having lower rates overall, I think that makes sense for our state. But I wouldn't have supported a bill that my opponent did where he voted to cut corporate tax rates for the largest corporations in Iowa by over 40%. I don't think that was the right approach. I think you should have focused on the lower income people and simplifying the tax rates overall. Because I think if you were to completely eliminate federal deductibility immediately instead of phasing it out over a 6-year period of time, you could have lowered rates for everybody. in a way that wouldn't blow a hole in the budget. Because ultimately, over the next 6 years, there's going to be about $2 billion less in available revenue, which will result in cuts further in our $7 billion budget, because you can't sustain a $7 billion budget if you're going to be cutting $2 billion out of revenue over that period of 6 years.
So you would not have voted for that bill in its final form?
Not in the final form.
What local priorities would you seek to champion if you were elected to the legislature again? What do you hear locally that folks in this community want you to go to bat for in Des Moines? Just give us a handful of those priorities.
There was a bill that ultimately didn't pass in the Iowa House when I was in the Iowa House that Chris Hall first sponsored back in 2011, and that was the senior fixed income property tax freeze that would allow seniors who have small fixed incomes, I believe, I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was a pretty low income, probably less than $40,000 or $1,000 or even lower. I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but that was a bill that Chris Hall first worked on in 2011 that I co-sponsored when I was in the Iowa House in 2013. I think we reintroduced it in 2015, and that's something I think that I hear a lot when I've knocked on doors. I've knocked on doors throughout the district in Plymouth and Woodbury County, and there's a lot of seniors out there who have fixed incomes who can't otherwise afford those huge increases in costs with regards to their property taxes, when they're also having to pay higher supplemental insurance costs for their Medicaid Part D. So if you're on a fixed income and those property tax issues really hit seniors hard in our community, and I think there's more we could do on that issue to help them. I also, had worked on property tax reform in 2013, and I was hoping that could have been included in the final package, and it was not. It was really focused once again on the large corporate interests in the state, which I think was a good bill overall, because it also capped the rate of growth of property taxes for residential and agricultural at 3% a year, where it used to be 4% per year. So we did do some things on property taxes, but I think there's more that could be done.
I'm going to generalize, but if you don't provide incentives to business for economic development, and you don't reduce taxes on businesses such as the corporate tax rate, how do you spur the growth you need to build your economy and to provide more tax to invest in areas such as education? If you're not growing, and don't those things contribute to economic growth that we need? Don't we need to grow in this state in terms of population and in terms of tax revenue produced by that growth?
And I never said I was against reducing corporate tax rates. I never said I was against giving out tax incentives to businesses if it's done in a smart way. We can't do it in a way that blows up the budget to provide basic services that are needed in the state, including K-12 education, Medicaid programs, transportation funding. There are services that the government provides that need to be in place that cannot always be provided by other types of programs. So we have to have adequate revenue to fund those priorities. But if there are ways to encourage job growth by having high-wage jobs come into the state, if there are ways to encourage businesses to come to the state by reducing tax rates overall and simplifying our tax structure so we don't have that complicated provision of federal deductibility that makes it more complex to understand the differences in our laws, there are things that we can do. I'm just saying that the bill that was passed this year didn't accomplish those goals. It didn't make things simpler, it didn't make things fair. It actually maintains a complex structure for our state with still over 6 individual tax rates for individuals, as well as for corporations. So I think we could have done it smarter, and it also worked towards encouraging business growth and development in our state, but just not the bill that was passed this year.
What are some other examples beyond the ones we've talked about? Are there other examples over the past 2 years where you find criticisms of the last General Assembly, which both houses were controlled by the other side, if you will, in addition to the taxes and the economic development incentives and the education funding? Are there other areas that you look at and say, well, I don't think the General Assembly of the last 2 years approached that problem in the proper way, or approached that problem enough? at all?
The other bill that I had a problem with was the one where my opponent voted to lower the minimum wage in the 4 counties that had increased the minimum wage because the state had failed to act. Iowa is a low wage state at this point in time. They've been stagnant for over the last 15 years. It's not just Republicans at fault, but the state hasn't voted to raise the minimum wage since 2007. It's been over 11 years since they voted to raise that. We're now behind Nebraska and South Dakota. Nebraska has $9. South Dakota has $8.80 plus an annual cost of living increase. So $7.25 for Iowa just doesn't make sense. We need to be moving towards catching up with Nebraska and South Dakota so that our wage rates for every employee don't stagnate across the state. And competing for jobs, why would somebody want to work in the state of Iowa if we undervalue our employees and our workers and don't pay them what they're worth? I think if you're working a 40-hour job per week, you shouldn't be living in poverty. So the bill that I had proposed in 2014 was a bill to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 per hour, which would provide an income, if you were working full-time, 40 hours a week, of about $21,000 a year, which would bring people out of poverty. People would be less reliant on having to rely on the Medicaid system if they didn't have access to health care. They'd be less reliant on welfare benefits and things like that, and other housing assistance and other programs that government taxpayers' dollars go into. So I think providing that fair minimum wage for Iowa workers is something that should be a priority for the state as well.
But can't you look at the minimum wage as a floor? And like you mentioned with Nebraska and South Dakota, if employers on that side of the river are paying higher wages, then you would think let the market dictate that employers in Iowa would have to match that in order to get quality workers, but then on the same token, should high school or college kids in their first job get the same wage as a full-time worker, so that you would have the opportunity to have somewhat lower wages for someone just starting out versus someone that's full-time and probably is making more than $10, $11, given the I just saw the unemployment rate is still at 2.5, I think, percent in Iowa now, lowest since I don't know when. And you would have to compete for jobs or to compete for workers. You have to pay a competitive wage in the first place, wouldn't you?
Over 80% of current minimum wage workers are actually single adults who has children to support. So it's a myth to believe that most minimum wage workers are high school students with their first job. I'm willing to look at that. If you're under the age of 18 and you're not supporting a family, it doesn't make sense for your first job to be lower than that, because you're not supporting somebody and you're not having to live and pay rent and buy all the food for your household. Those types of issues, yes, absolutely make sense to look into, make sure it's done in a fair way and it's structured appropriately. But you shouldn't be paying somebody who is a single mom with 2 kids struggling to get by poverty wages. And that's what people can do, especially in service industries, that they're not high skilled jobs. But yes, they should be providing some minimal level of income that people can survive on. They shouldn't be struggling day to day just to be able to make rent.
Another issue of the last General Assembly that was divisive, conflicting viewpoints again on both sides of it, and that's the collective bargaining bill, the changes that were made in 2017. Give us again your kind of overall assessment of those changes. Would you seek to or support or advocate for rolling those back and going back to Chapter 20 as it was before that bill? Give us your thoughts on that, please.
And I did disagree with my opponent, Jim Carlin, who voted to repeal collective bargaining rights. I think in the state of Iowa, whether you work for the private sector or the public sector, you should have the right to collectively bargain over not just wages, but also other benefits, health insurance, and conditions of your employment. I think that's a fair deal for people to have that right, and it affected thousands of Iowans, from city employees to county employees to state employees, school employees. And I don't think that's what they campaigned on in 2016. It's not something I ever saw anybody ever discuss at all. There had been bills in the past when I was in the Iowa House to try and tweak the issue with regards to arbitration and the factors that arbitrators could consider. And if that was done in a fair way, I think that was something that could be considered. But wholesale repeal, other than one issue of base wages having to do with caps of no more than 3%, but also cost of living increase by the CPI, I don't think that was the right approach. They also having to do recertification elections, which is wasting a lot of time and resources for all collective bargaining units across the state, from firefighters to police officers to small town school districts. Those are costing a lot of resources and time that could otherwise better be spent on providing services through the jobs that they do, because these are public servants, the people that lost their rights, and I don't think that was a fair bill at all.
We are just under 5 minutes.
Okay, so the advocates for the bill would say that the old system was weighted too much in favor of the public sector unions, and that this bill gave the taxpayers of the state more of a voice at the table. And what I hear you saying is you would have been supportive of steps that would have perhaps evened the playing field and given them more of a voice in terms of, I think you called them tweaks here and there, but you thought this bill went too far.
I agree. It absolutely went too far.
That's your position, essentially.
Yes.
Went too far.
Yes.
But you would be supportive of making changes, for example, to arbitration, as you mentioned, that would seek to give the taxpayers a greater voice and to level the process out a little bit.
Yes, there has to be a process by which people consider, can the local taxpayers afford this? Is it sustainable? Does it make sense? We don't want to force property tax owners to have huge burdens year after year, but I believe the system in place was working well. It was rare that people, especially here in Siouxland, went to arbitration over issues because they were able to work out differences and come to fair agreements. Given that the system that was in place. I think there were concerns that when it did go to arbitration in those rare cases, it didn't work the way that it could have or should have. In the past, I think the bills that they wrote in the House I did not support because they weren't written in a fair way, but I think there were ways you could have improved that system.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick one?
Sure.
In this political climate you're coming into, how do you make a difference if you don't have a majority? You know, does that bother you? Does that worry you? Does you think, what can I do if we don't have the votes?
I never worried about being in the House minority when I was in the minority for 4 years because I worked hard for my constituents. It didn't matter who my constituent was, whether they were an independent, a Democrat, or Republican. If they brought me a good idea that they were strongly passionate about and that I believed was good for the whole state of Iowa, I wanted to advocate for that issue, and I worked to build relationships across the aisle. I had good working relationships on several of the committees that I served on with Republicans and Democrats, and wanted to make sure that I could add my voice from our community and how it would help our community. So I think I have the skills necessary to work whether I'm in the majority party or in the minority party, because I will work hard on behalf of my constituents in Siouxland in trying to make Iowa a better state by working together for common sense solutions for the state of Iowa.
We have 2 minutes.
What are your biggest criticisms, or what are the biggest distinctions, if you will, between you and Senator Carlin? Biggest differences.
Distinguishing differences are there are many of the votes that he took. He voted to lower the minimum wage. I support raising the minimum wage. He voted to take away collective bargaining rights from public sector workers. I support maintaining and restoring those rights. He voted for huge corporate giveaways for the state that I don't believe are going to end up helping the state out and will end up blowing a hole in our budget. I would not have voted for that bill. He voted to underfund K-12 education, forcing property taxes to rise. I would have made sure that we provided an adequate level of funding for K-12 education to make sure that we had a strong school system, whether you were in an urban area or a small town area. So I think there are a lot of issues that are important to Iowans where we differ, and I think they should go vote on November the 6th and decide which direction they want to take the state.
And last question would be, why should you get the vote as opposed to your opponent? A better choice.
I think I'm a strong leader. I was selected in 2011 by the Iowa Association of Business and Industry to be part of the Leadership Iowa program, which is a premier issues awareness and leadership program, selected one of 40 people in the whole state of Iowa. I was also recognized in 2016 by the Iowa State Sheriffs and Deputies Association for leadership on issues of public safety and law enforcement issues. My background as a prosecutor, I've worked with people from all walks of life, from low-income people with substance abuse issues to high-income people who are foster parents, from people who work for the state of Iowa, from people who are advocates for or against different issues, and I think I could work together with anybody to accomplish good things for Siouxland and Senate District 3.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.